You ever notice how people get uncomfortable when they can't control you? Not loud, not obvious, just a quiet tension in the air. Because you didn't beg for their approval. You didn't shrink to fit their expectations. You didn't play the little social games they rely on to feel powerful, and that bothers them. Because most people are trained, conditioned, to seek validation like oxygen. They measure their worth in likes, praise, acceptance, permission. But you walked a different path. You made your choices without asking, without explaining, without apologizing. And now they don't know what to do with you. You became unpredictable, unmanageable, untouchable in a way they can't define. Not because you're louder, not because you're stronger, but because you're free in a way they've never experienced. And freedom, real freedom, has a way of exposing everyone who's still trapped. Silence isn't weakness. It's the one thing people can't manipulate when they're used to controlling reactions. Most people speak to be accepted, to be reassured, to be seen. They fill every gap with explanations, justifications, and noise, hoping someone out there nods in approval so they can finally feel secure. But you didn't do that. You stopped performing. You stopped asking. And that silence, it changed everything. When you don't chase validation, you remove the leash people didn't even realize they had on you. They expect reactions. They expect you to defend yourself, to prove your worth, to argue your side, to explain your choices. It's how they measure you, how they keep you within reach. But when you give them nothing, no emotional response, no desperate explanation, no need for their approval, it creates something they can't process, a gap, an absence. And people fear what they can't read. Your silence becomes a mirror. It reflects their own need for approval back at them, and most people can't handle that. They start questioning themselves. Why didn't you react? Why didn't you care? Why didn't you try to fix how they see you? That confusion turns into discomfort, and that discomfort slowly turns into resentment. Because in a world where everyone is competing for attention and validation, someone who doesn't play the game feels like a threat. They'll try to provoke you. Subtle comments, passive aggression, little tests designed to pull you back into the cycle. They want to see if they can still get a reaction out of you, if they still matter enough to disturb your peace. And every time you stay silent, every time you refuse to engage, it frustrates them even more. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you've taken away their influence. People are used to controlling the narrative. If they can get you to react, they can define you. If you argue, they label you defensive. If you explain, they pick apart your words. If you seek approval, they decide when to give it and when to take it away. But silence denies them that control. It keeps your identity out of their hands. It forces them to sit with their own assumptions, their own insecurities, their own need to be validated by your response. And that's what they can't stand. Not the silence itself, but what it represents: independence, self-trust, a sense of worth that doesn't fluctuate based on someone else's opinion. It's unsettling because it breaks the unspoken rules everyone else is following. The rule that says you must explain yourself. The rule that says you must care what others think. The rule that says your value is something others get to decide. When you choose silence, You're not just withholding words. You're rejecting that entire system. You're saying, without saying anything at all, that your choices don't need approval, your identity doesn't need validation, and your peace isn't up for negotiation. And people notice that. They feel it in the way you don't react to criticism, in the way you don't chase praise, in the way you move without needing permission. It creates a distance they can't close, a boundary they can't cross, because there's nothing for them to grab onto, no insecurity to exploit, no need to feed. So they watch, they speculate, they judge. They try to make sense of you using the same rules they live by, but it never quite fits. Because silence, when it comes from strength, isn't empty. It's controlled, intentional, unshaken. And the more you hold that silence, the more it speaks for you in ways words never could. There's something unsettling about a person who can't be controlled. Not loud, not aggressive, not even trying to prove anything. Just existing in a way that doesn't bend. Most people rely on predictability. They read patterns, reactions, emotional cues. It's how they decide who they can influence, who they can ignore, and who they can quietly manipulate. But when someone steps outside that pattern, when their presence doesn't follow the expected script, it creates tension that lingers in the background. You don't react the way they expect. You don't get pulled into the same emotional loops. Praise doesn't inflate you. Criticism doesn't shake you, and silence doesn't pressure you into speaking. That alone is enough to make people uneasy. Because now they don't know where they stand with you, and more importantly, they don't know how to position themselves around you. The usual strategies stop working. Most interactions are subtle exchanges of control. A look, a tone, a carefully chosen word, all designed to guide the outcome in someone's favor. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's just habit, something people picked up without even realizing it. But you don't respond to those cues. You don't adjust yourself to keep others comfortable. You don't shift your behavior to match their expectations. And when that control slips, even slightly, it exposes how much they relied on it. Your presence becomes difficult to categorize. They can't label you easily, and that bothers them more than they'd admit. If you were loud, they'd call you attention-seeking. If you were insecure, they'd dismiss you. If you were desperate for approval, they'd know exactly how to handle you. But you don't fit into any of those boxes. You move on your own terms, and that makes you unpredictable in a way that feels threatening. Unpredictability isn't chaos. It's independence. It means your actions aren't driven by external pressure. You're not responding to the environment in the way people expect, and that breaks their ability to anticipate you. When they can't predict you, they can't control you. And when they can't control you, they start to question their own position. They might try to reassert control in small ways, testing boundaries, making assumptions, pushing for reactions. Sometimes it's subtle, almost invisible, a comment meant to provoke, a situation designed to corner you. They're not always aware they're doing it. It's just their way of restoring a sense of order, of bringing things back into a framework they understand. But it doesn't work the same with you, because you're not playing the same game. You don't respond to pressure the way they expect. You don't rush to fix misunderstandings or chase clarity. You don't feel the need to make yourself more digestible just so others can feel comfortable, and that refusal creates a gap between you and them, a space where their usual influence can't reach. That space is what unsettles them. It forces them to confront something unfamiliar. A person who doesn't need their approval, doesn't rely on their reactions, and doesn't adjust their identity to fit the situation. It's not aggressive, but it's firm, not distant, but self-contained. And that kind of presence shifts the balance in ways they can't easily control. They start to watch more closely, trying to figure you out, looking for patterns, for weaknesses, for anything that brings you back into a predictable shape. But the more they observe, the more they realize there's nothing obvious to hold on to, no clear way in. And that's when discomfort turns into resistance, because it's easier to label what they don't understand than to accept it. Easier to call it cold, distant, or strange than to admit they've lost their usual grip on the situation. All because you didn't bend. You didn't follow the script. You didn't give them the version of yourself they were expecting. Independence has a way of revealing things people try to hide. Not because you're exposing them directly, but because your choices make their compromises more visible. Most people don't like to admit how much they rely on others to feel secure. Approval, agreement, reassurance. It becomes a quiet dependency, something they build their identity around without ever questioning it. But when you move without that need, it disrupts the illusion. You don't look for permission. You don't wait for validation before making decisions. You trust your own judgment, even when it goes against what everyone else expects. And that alone creates a contrast they can't ignore, because now your confidence stands next to their hesitation, your clarity next to their doubt, your self-trust next to their constant need for reassurance. That contrast feels uncomfortable. It's easier for people when everyone operates on the same level of dependence. When everyone seeks approval, no one stands out. No one has to question why they need it. It becomes normal, almost invisible. But the moment someone steps outside that pattern, the difference becomes obvious. And with that difference comes a quiet kind of pressure. They start to compare. Not always consciously, but it happens. They notice how you don't second-guess yourself in the same way. How you don't over-explain your choices or adjust your personality to keep the peace. And instead of inspiring them, that difference often makes them defensive, because it forces them to confront something they'd rather avoid, their own insecurity. It shows up in small ways, doubt disguised as concern, criticism framed as advice. Questions that aren't really questions, but subtle attempts to pull you back into their way of thinking. They might say you're too distant, too confident, too different. But what they're really reacting to is the discomfort of seeing someone operate without the same limitations they've accepted for themselves. Independence removes the shared excuses. When you rely on yourself, you don't participate in the same justifications. You don't say things like, "I had no choice," or "I needed their approval," because those reasons don't apply to you anymore. And that makes it harder for others to hold on to those beliefs without questioning them. Your actions challenge the narratives they use to stay comfortable. and people protect their comfort. They'll try to redefine your independence in a way that makes it easier to dismiss. Call it arrogance. Call it detachment. Call it something negative so they don't have to see it for what it is. Because if they acknowledge it as strength, then they have to face the possibility that they've been holding themselves back. It's not about you doing anything extraordinary. It's about what you're not doing. You're not seeking constant reassurance. You're not adjusting your path to fit someone else's expectations. You're not giving others the power to define your worth. And in a world where that behavior is common, your refusal stands out more than any loud achievement. They feel it in conversations, in decisions, in the way you carry yourself. There's no underlying need driving your actions, no subtle request for approval hidden beneath your words, and that absence creates a kind of tension they can't easily resolve. Because now the focus shifts. It's no longer about what you're doing wrong or right. It becomes about what they're lacking, what they're depending on, what they've been avoiding. Your independence doesn't just set you apart. It holds up a reflection they didn't ask for, and not everyone is ready to see themselves that clearly. So they resist, they question, they judge. Not because you've created a problem, but because your presence makes existing problems harder to ignore. Most people don't realize how much of their life is shaped by unspoken rules. Not laws, not forced instructions, just quiet expectations that guide how they speak, act, and even think. Blend in, agree enough to be accepted, adjust just enough to avoid conflict. It becomes automatic. A script they follow without ever questioning who wrote it, and then you step outside of it, not loudly, not dramatically. You just stop following what never made sense to you in the first place. You say what you mean without polishing it for approval. You make choices without waiting for consensus. You walk away from situations that don't align, even when staying would have been easier. And that simple refusal begins to crack the structure others rely on. Because now the script doesn't work the same. People expect certain responses. Agreement where there's disagreement. Silence where truth would be uncomfortable. A version of you that fits neatly into what they understand. But when you don't deliver that, when you break the pattern they're used to, it throws everything off balance. It forces them to adjust in ways they're not prepared for. They might try to guide you back into place. Subtle corrections, small pressures, reminders of how things are done. Not always aggressive, sometimes even framed as concern or advice. But underneath it is a need to restore familiarity. Because your refusal to conform doesn't just affect you, it disrupts the environment they're comfortable in. You stop playing along with expectations that were never truly yours, and that makes people question why they still are. Conformity is safe. It offers predictability. It tells people where they belong and how to behave to maintain that position. When everyone follows the same patterns, there's a sense of order. No one stands out too much, no one challenges the system, and no one has to deal with the discomfort of thinking differently. But the moment someone steps outside of that, the illusion of stability starts to weaken. Your choices highlight the gaps, the things people tolerate without admitting it. The compromises they've made to stay accepted. The parts of themselves they've set aside to fit in. And when those things become visible, even indirectly, it creates resistance, because acknowledging it would mean admitting they had a choice all along. So instead, they focus on you. They label your behavior. Call it difficult, rebellious, unrealistic. Anything that brings it back into a category they can dismiss. Because if they can define it as a problem, they don't have to see it as an alternative. They don't have to consider changing anything about their own lives. But your refusal isn't about them. It's not about proving a point or standing against anyone. It's about alignment, about choosing what feels true instead of what feels expected. And that kind of decision doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It shows up in the way you don't compromise your values for convenience, in the way you don't pretend to agree just to keep things smooth, in the way you're willing to stand alone rather than blend into something that doesn't fit. That quiet resistance carries weight because it's consistent. It doesn't shift based on who you're around or what the situation demands. It's not influenced by pressure or the need to belong. And over time, that consistency becomes impossible to ignore. Not because you're forcing anyone to notice, but because the difference becomes too clear to overlook. You didn't break the rules loudly. You just stopped following them. People assume power comes from intensity, from louder reactions, sharper words, stronger displays of emotion. They think the one who feels the most, shows the most, reacts the fastest is the one in control. But that's not how it works. Reaction is exposure. The more you react, the more you reveal, and the more you reveal, the easier it becomes for others to understand you, predict you, and eventually influence you. You learn to step back from that. Not because you don't feel anything, but because you don't hand your emotions out like evidence. You don't let every comment pull you into a response. You don't let every situation dictate your state of mind. There's a space between what happens and how you respond, and you've made that space yours. Controlled, intentional, unavailable to anyone who tries to reach in and disturb it. That alone shifts the balance. When people can't read your emotional state, they lose one of their main tools of control. They can't tell what affects you, what motivates you, what might push you to react. And that uncertainty makes them cautious. Because now every move they make feels less certain. They're used to feedback, immediate, visible reactions that guide their next step. But with you, that feedback is missing. And that absence creates tension. They might test the waters. Say something designed to get a rise out of you. Push a boundary just enough to see where it stands. Not always consciously. Sometimes it's instinct. People are drawn to patterns, and when they can't find one, they try to create one. But your responses don't follow a predictable path. Sometimes you say nothing. Sometimes you respond without emotion. Sometimes you walk away entirely. And none of it gives them what they're looking for, because emotional detachment isn't about being cold. It's about being selective. You decide what deserves your energy and what doesn't. You don't react just because something happens. You react because you choose to. And that choice, that control, is what shifts the dynamic. They can't provoke you into revealing more than you're willing to show. That frustrates them, because most interactions rely on emotional exchange. A reaction for a reaction. Energy for energy. It creates a loop where both sides are constantly influencing each other. But when you step out of that loop, when you stop feeding into it, the connection changes. It becomes one-sided. And people don't like feeling like they're the only ones investing. They might interpret it as distance, as disinterest, as something negative they can point to and define. But what they're really reacting to is the lack of access. They can't reach you the same way they reach others. They can't pull you into the same emotional patterns. And without that access, their influence weakens. That's where the shift happens. You're no longer responding to maintain harmony or avoid conflict. You're responding based on what actually matters to you. And when nothing does, you stay still. You don't force engagement. You don't fill silence with unnecessary words. You don't react just to keep the interaction alive. That stillness carries weight, because it's not passive, it's deliberate. It shows that your emotional state isn't controlled by external triggers. It's managed internally on your terms. And that kind of control isn't easy to challenge. It doesn't give others a clear entry point, no obvious weakness to push against, no predictable response to rely on. So they keep trying to figure it out, watching for patterns that aren't there, looking for cracks that don't appear. And the more they search, the more they realize they're dealing with something they can't easily influence. Not louder, not stronger, just untouchable in a way they don't understand. Freedom isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or ask to be recognized. It moves quietly, without permission, without explanation. And that's exactly why it unsettles people who have spent their lives depending on something outside of themselves to feel stable. Because when someone stands in front of them, calm, self-contained, unaffected by the usual pressures, it exposes a reality they've been avoiding. Most people don't realize how much they depend on external anchors. Approval, routines, expectations, roles. They build their sense of identity around these things. It gives them structure, a feeling of control. But it also creates limits, invisible boundaries they rarely question, because stepping outside of them feels uncertain, even dangerous. So they stay within what's familiar, convincing themselves it's the only way. And then they see you, not bound by the same need for validation, not adjusting your direction to fit someone else's expectations. You make choices that don't always make sense to them, and you stand by them without seeking reassurance. That kind of freedom doesn't fit into their framework. It doesn't follow the same logic they rely on to understand people. So it feels unpredictable. And unpredictability creates discomfort. Because if your decisions aren't guided by the same rules, then they can't anticipate your behavior. They can't measure you using the same standards. They can't place you neatly into a role that makes sense to them. And when people can't categorize something, they often see it as a threat. Not necessarily because it is one, but because it challenges the order they're used to. Your freedom highlights their dependence. It shows them, without directly pointing it out, that there are other ways to exist, other ways to think, to decide, to live without constantly seeking alignment with what others expect. And that realization creates tension, because it forces a question they might not want to answer. If you can do it, why can't they? That question doesn't always lead to growth. Sometimes it leads to resistance. They might try to downplay your choices, call them unrealistic, risky, unnecessary, not because they've truly evaluated them, but because dismissing them is easier than confronting the possibility that they've limited themselves. If they can label your freedom as a flaw, they don't have to see it as an option. But that doesn't change what it represents. It's not about rejecting everything or going against every expectation. It's about not being controlled by them. You understand the rules, you see the patterns, but you don't let them dictate your identity. You choose when to follow, when to step away, and when to ignore them entirely. That choice is what sets you apart, because it's not based on reaction. It's not driven by the need to prove anything. It's simply a reflection of self-trust, a belief that your direction doesn't need to be validated to be real. And that kind of belief is difficult to challenge. People can argue with your decisions, question your logic, even criticize your path, but they can't easily break something that isn't built on their approval in the first place. There's no dependency to exploit, no reliance to disrupt, so they watch from a distance, trying to understand what drives you, what keeps you steady without the same support systems they rely on. And the more they observe, the more they realize that what they're seeing isn't recklessness or defiance. It's something far more unsettling. A person who doesn't need the system to feel complete